Hello, welcome back everyone. I'm going to go over the characteristics of a true dichotomy in as little space as possible, so it's just straight to the point. Because I know I dance around a lot in my other videos, so here is more or less the majority of, if not all of, the characteristics within a true dichotomy. I'm going to try to articulate it. So just an example is the gluttony and abstinence true dichotomy. So you have, first you're like, okay, what are these concepts? And gluttony is like, as we've seen more and more examples of it, it's when people are eating too much. So as you get closer and closer to the extreme, you have to start rationalizing it or making an example more and more, because there would be less people over there. I mean, not in today's society, but back when they were first understanding these concepts. So rationalizing extreme gluttony is to making a case for the absolute supreme worst case scenario when it comes to how much food you're eating, how much bad food you're eating. And it's a concept that carries over to many other things. But when we're talking about just specifically food, how much food you consume, how much calories you consume, sugar, etc., you have the rationalized extreme of gluttony, which is like someone who's bedridden, cannot get out of their bed. So that's rationalizing the extreme. So once you understand one extreme, boom, you have a point. And then, but that you can make the case for something that's one past it, like the most extreme thing that probably isn't really possible in reality for any real person. But now that you have that extreme, then you see like what's possible in reality. So then you can abstract it. You don't have to actually experience it yourself or see it to understand that that's the extreme. So then you have the physical possible spectrum that goes all the way across until you more or less are at a decent weight, and then you start drifting on the opposite side, which is physical, like abstinence, which is either reserving yourself from food, throwing it up, anything that involves you no longer ingesting calories or sugar, etc., all the way down to what's physically possible before you die. And then you rationalize one past that. So the rationalized extreme of abstinence is like absolute depravity of all food and sustenance to the point where you just die. So and obviously both extremes are bad and we want to stay away from them. And I make this case for every true dichotomy. There is no extreme on each side of a true dichotomy in which you would desire that outcome. So then you have rationalized the extreme low end, and you've rationalized the extreme high end of each true dichotomy, or in this case, just gluttony and abstinence. You understand the extreme that you want to stay away from. And then you have what's physically possible abstinence, which is the left bar for each individual, and then the possible right, more or less, boundary for what's gluttonously possible. And you have the full spectrum. And then you have the equilibrium window, which I would say is just healthy weight. Like, what is a healthy weight between these two where people can flux? Because it's not right in the middle. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be right in the middle. It's okay to have the variation. And obviously we're leaning more and more towards, in our Western society, towards extreme gluttony, and it's shifted our perceptions of everything. So we starting to think of like people who are more and more out of shape as being the norm. And the equilibrium window, I wouldn't say it's shifting, but where we are, the bell curve of everyone is shifting along the window towards rationalized, or the rationalized extreme of gluttony. So what you can say is the subjective perspective is each individual's perspective of their situation. So, and then you can weigh someone, let's say they weigh 450 pounds. That would be an objective measurement, which is a really rationalized point, because you can't have infinite accuracy, which is another true dichotomy, is the degree of accuracy of something. You can't have 0% accuracy, because as soon as you articulate something, and to say it's not accurate, you're somewhat accurate no matter what your measurement is. And then because you can't have a zero measurement. You have to have some kind of measurement for it to be accurate at all. So even if your measurement is infinite and you say it's infinite, you have some degree of accuracy in that measurement. So even though infinite can't exist. So the point is, a rationalized point is what we consider to be an objective perspective. Even though it's not objective, we consider it to be because we're rationalizing it. So we just agree, go ahead and agree, it's close enough for all intents and purposes to the actual measurement we're aiming for it to facilitate what we're trying to use it for. So that's what objective means. So rationalized means we know that it's not perfectly accurate to reality and we can never get perfect accuracy, but the objective measurement is just we've got past accepting it, and now it's good enough to utilize for any intents and purposes that we have to use it for. And then there's a subjective perspective of that. So if I was 450 pounds, I can feel it. Like I know what it feels like now. It's a subjective perspective of this. Or you're actually witnessing it with your own experience, like what this looks like in somebody else. So that's why we have mirror neurons, or like we're living vicariously through what we're witnessing in that subjective perspective. So either we're subjecting it to ourselves or we're seeing it subjective to someone else's experience through our mirror neurons. So that's what mirror neurons do, is they basically tell you what it would be like to be in that other subjective experience, the actual subjective experience. So it's a subjective perspective of their subjective experience. So then you have relative perspective. So again, this is to say, I'm skinny. I guess a better way to put it is, we can use the gluttony abstinence. Like if I'm skinny and I see someone fat, then I know I have a better relative perspective of more of the entire spectrum of abstinence and gluttony. So the more points and examples you see all along the spectrum, the more you see the entire spectrum. So then you have the subjective perspective of that, because each individual is only going to have their own understanding of where this spectrum is, or where they are, or where everyone else is relative to this. Because if you've never seen a fat person, you don't know you don't know the full breadth of the dichotomy. And that's what relative perspective gives you. It's like the more examples you see relative to every other example, the more you see the full breadth of the true dichotomy underlying it. And that would be subjective as well, because you can't just, somebody would have to know what you're talking about between these two extremes and the different examples in between before they can even understand this concept. So you have to have examples and before you can even understand that. And then you have, so the equilibrium window, right? And the only thing beyond this is when we've reached an equilibrium window between every true dichotomy, that's what I call homeostasis. And that's the only other thing that I tack onto these ideas of true dichotomies, is that what we're aiming for in our society across the board is a homeostasis between all the equilibrium windows of all the true dichotomies. And another true dichotomy is, for example, is tall and short. So when somebody's as short as possible, it's unhealthy. And when somebody's as tall as what's possible in reality, it's unhealthy. And then we can rationalize the extreme of that to give people a better understanding of the full breadth of the true dichotomy. And I argue that's what people in biblical scriptures have been trying to tell us, like with these ideas of sin. And like when you play the game Diablo, you see like the most extreme examples of these, like one of them is a liar, one of them is gluttonous. Like you have Butcher, right? Like he's a big chunky guy. So this is what they've been trying to articulate, is like these rationalized extremes. Like they don't exist in reality. Like none of these demons actually exist physically, but it's just for you to understand the concept of these extremes. So there's no such thing as something that's good that's extreme. And that's what I argue for. And I kind of just added this little note for myself. And I can read it off to you guys. So that's more or less all the characteristics. It's pretty simple and elegant. And the only other thing I guess I can add is that if you imagine you keep zooming in on the line further and further and further, you would go in infinitely. Because again, you can't have 100% accuracy. So if you keep zooming in, this is what represents fractals when people have a psilocybin trip. It's like you're zooming in on these true dichotomies further and further, but you're never actually getting anywhere. So because you can only get more and more accurate, and it never stops, because there's an infinite number of there's an infinite number of weights that we can be, and it depends on our accuracy to which degree we're actually measuring how much we weigh. So there's an infinites inside of the full breadth of the spectrum, but the spectrum itself is bounded by reality. Like once somebody gets to a certain point of being fat, and they're the fattest person that's ever existed, that is our new rationalized extreme boundary. Or that's the one step before the rationalized extreme boundary. So until we have an example of how much, or mathematically show how much fat someone can have and how much someone can weigh before there's no way for them to possibly exist anymore, that would be our rationalized extreme. Like it's not necessarily necessary to even know that, unless you want to understand the full breadth of the dichotomy. But you know that in the middle, the equilibrium, the balance is where you want to be. So this is why morality is subjective and objective. Depending on the context, the objective part is what we know the extremes are, what we can stay away from. The subjective part is the context, and individual interests will have a bell curve of difference between them that shifts over time for our species to be maximally adaptable. So we want our species to be adaptable. That's why you don't just choose a point on here and say this is perfectly ideal and healthy. It's a window, and that window, our bell curve across which we've been selected for by nature, is the maximum amount of differentiation that is maximally adaptable to every situation that we've been in as a species, and possibly further down the line. Especially since now that we live in societies, we're now selecting for different traits that are better in terms of what would survive in a situation of society, or the context of society. So this is more or less the foundation for everything I argue for in dichotomology. This is what a true dichotomy is. And the two sides that we rationalize as the dichotomy we typically refer to as dichotomy is abstinence and gluttony. And we just say that's the dichotomy here. But in reality, it's an entire spectrum. So this just adds the nuance between those two rationalized extremes that we just refer to as the dichotomy. So this is a true dichotomy, whereas abstinence and gluttony, just having those two concepts next to each other, is a rationalized dichotomy. And then and this is the rationalization of the extreme of those two concepts. So this is, again, the characteristics of it. And I hope I summed it up as basically as I could, so that you can get the concepts more and more as you attach different true dichotomies together. Thank you guys for your time. Love you. And I hope you learned something.